Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Dr. Dylan Carmody. Dylan is a physical therapist and he has done extensive work into calf profiling and training and understanding the lower limb musculature. Today we dive into that exactly. We explore the lower limb, get into the weeds about the calf muscle group, about the muscles of the foot, and so much more that way. We talk about a variety of important considerations from an anatomical and physiological perspective and apply that into training, testing, and rehab settings. Episodes like this are made possible by ISOFIT. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training. Enjoy. Dylan, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. Thank you so much for being here, man.
Dan, I appreciate the opportunity and I'm stoked to have this conversation. I think it'll be a real good time diving into a bunch of interesting topics, at least for me.
For people who aren't familiar with you and the amazing work that you do from the clinical side, the podcast side, and all the amazing things that way, would you mind giving them a quick rundown about who you are and all that you do that way?
My name is Dylan Carmody. I am a physical therapist, strength and conditioning coach, and kind of wannabe sports scientist at this point. Currently holding a couple different roles in the rehab and performance spaces. At the moment, I primarily work with VALD, where I work at trying to disseminate a lot of the quality information that some of the people that also work at VALD are able to produce, but doing so in a more digestible format and for those that maybe are just getting started with some of this kind of sports science and data analytics side of performance. And so what we've been doing over the last year or so is, really putting out some of those, practitioners' guides to force plates or practitioners' guides to isometrics and those sorts of things. And so that's been a really fun project on our end to, really work alongside some of the, world leaders in these sorts of topics and be able to best understand how they convey information in those sort of niche topics and be able to do so for the masses and those who are still just kind of getting started on those topics. That I kind of also work in a couple other settings. I do some clinical work and kind of remote coaching through Citizen Athletics, where I am a fitness and rehab coach, taking people from whether it's, I've got a couple, pro soccer players on my register right now. And then I've also got somebody with a complete total pec rupture, just trying to get back to normal daily activities. And so pretty much spans the gamut of that, which has been a really fun opportunity to just, exercise the more kind of skills associated with communication and exercise prescription. And then I also am a host of the Research Unpacked episodes from the Informed Performance podcast, as well as kind of am an individual contributor for some of the products and projects that we put out there. So most recently released a calf muscle force profiling ebook that kind of dives into likely what is a lot of our conversation and stuff today, but a couple other kind of profiling and measurement strategies there.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I mean, you certainly do a lot of different things that way. It's funny, I didn't even realize you had a position with Valve that way. You're actually our first person on the podcast that's been affiliated with Valve here. So congratulations, Dylan. No, you're right on the calf profiling thing. And it's funny because I think that's where the majority of our initial conversation together went is, in today's day and age, you can go online and find so many different videos of people doing exercises for their lower leg musculature, whether it's anterior tib, which is apparently now like the most important muscle in the body ever, or calf training and so on that way. I feel like a lot of what I've seen, though, is a little bit misinformed or misguided, I guess I'll say. You mentioned that you're kind of the sports science, data science guy here on the rehab side of things. So I guess we'll start it off with just in general from, the muscles of the lower leg in the anterior compartment, posterior compartment, and so on that way, from a general anatomical consideration, what's there? And overall, like strength wise, are these things strong? Are they involved in a lot of different movements and exercises and, sports performance types things that way? Or are these things that, we really don't need to train? Or where does your head go around the muscles of this lower leg region that way?
It is a very interesting topic right now, and I think that also there have been a little bit of an influx in some of the recent kind of notable injuries associated with the lower limb, whether it's Achilles tendon ruptures, calf muscle strains, those sorts of things. And so I think that it's gotten a lot more attention as of the last year or two. Some of the mechanisms we can probably go into a little bit later, but Yeah, from an overall perspective, just talking about the lower limb in general, I like to look at things from a muscular perspective first, and just look at, okay, what's the low hanging fruit associated with most musculature, and that's generally size. And so what we see from a lot of literature is there's around like a 6 to 2 to 1 ratio of physiologic cross-sectional area when you compare the soleus, the medial gastroc, and the lateral gastroc. So we know that from a just sheer muscle size perspective, the soleus is going to be a very large muscle. It actually takes up 70% of the volume of the lower limb itself. And so we know that that muscle as a whole is just a very large muscle, and it also is capable of producing a lot of high forces as well. We can kind of dive into some of the actual kinetics behind that in a bit, but just kind of from an anatomy overview, obviously the triceps surae complex is the soleus and two gastroc heads. And then some people will include the Achilles tendon within that because it's all within the same plantar flexor mechanism. When we look superficially at the gastroc, obviously there's two heads to it, and each head is what is considered a unipennant muscle. So there are pennation angles associated with that that tend to be there just as a way to fit more muscle fibers in the same relative space so that there's a greater force producing potential, which is kind of the main mechanism of why certain fibers are or why certain muscles are pinnated. When we look at some of those kind of things in terms of being able to discern like why that might be relevant, pennation angles tend to be pretty they tend to coincide a lot with muscle fascicle lengths and fiber lengths. And so when we see a muscle fiber that has longer muscle lengths or longer fiber length itself, it generally indicates that you're going to have faster shortening velocities because it has to cover more distance. And it also is going to increase rate of force development relatively just because of that faster fascicle shortening velocity. And so when we look at something like the gastroc, it's a little bit more similar to things like the hamstrings, where the gastroc itself is around 65 millimeters for its kind of fascicle length, whereas the soleus is around 50. And so when we look at pennation angles, they tend to be quite variable with those muscle groups just because relative amounts of hypertrophy and those sorts of things are different between individuals. But generally, when we look at those fascicle lengths, we can kind of start to develop a little bit of a hypothesis saying, okay, cool, if we have longer fascicle lengths in the gastroc versus the soleus, then likely we're going to look at something more being like the gastroc being faster twitch, quote unquote, than the soleus. And that also kind of lines up with the fiber type distributions that we see as well. So it's about a 50-50 split between type 1 and type 2 fibers in the gastroc, whereas in the soleus, it's about an 80-20 split. And so with the 80% biasing that type 1 fiber. And so it's funny that you had mentioned kind of this idea of a lot of low load strengthening exercises for the lower limb and things like that, because I think a lot of times you go through school or you get inundated with certain kind of old school information where you hear, okay, type 1 oxidative fibers, well, that's likely is kind of quote unquote postural based muscle, right? It's just meant to kind of keep you upright. It's kind of like the erectors or like something else where it's just supposed to maintain balance. Whereas in reality, the soleus itself is going to produce upwards of 80% of the total plantar flexor peak force. And so the actual abilities of that muscle don't necessarily only indicate there being a quote unquote postural muscle. There's some interesting kind of connective tissue considerations associated with the lower limb as well. When we look at the gastroc itself, as most people can kind of picture, the heads of the gastroc sit more, a little bit higher up on the lower limb than does the soleus. And so what you see is that there's actually like a distribution of connective tissue between the base or the bottom portion of the gastroc before those kind of subtendons of the gastroc form the Achilles tendon. And so what that area of connective tissue is termed is called the gastrocnemius runout. And that is, again, just a portion of free tendon that isn't necessarily the Achilles tendon, but is tendinous material after the gastroc ends. And so there isn't a whole lot of data to suggest, anything in particular, but there's a bunch of hypotheses around what that may contribute when it comes to potential injury mechanisms. We know that the kind of aponeurotic disruption in that same area when it comes to a calf strain is going to indicate a longer return to play and those sorts of things. And so there may be increased shear forces depending on the length of that gastrocnemius runout, which could then implicate things like certain exercise, variables or certain ways in which somebody may be ready for exercises. A lot of times people will talk about how there may be this concomitant knee extension with plantar flexion that allows for that kind of sliding aspect of the gastroc muscle belly on top of the soleus, which creates those shear forces. And so without diving too far into any one area, that's kind of, I guess, a brief overview of the muscular side of things when it comes to the lower limb, but we can kind of take it anywhere else.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think you broke that down really well, Dylan. Kind of diving into the gastroc and soleus and the overall triceps surae complex a bit more. And I think those are primarily the main muscles down there that people think about. And I think that the anatomy review is essential because if you don't understand what's going on under the hood, so to speak, then it's a lot harder to intervene. And some of those different things that you brought up, such as pennation angle that way, there is a certain genetic element to some of those things, which I think can explain in part why some athletes are, significantly better than other people at certain things, not everything. But I do think that some of these different little factors like muscle fiber type or pennation angle and so on that way can definitely play a small role in that. And I think that your point on the soleus is very interesting as well, because you're right. Typically, when people hear slow endurance type fibers, they think, well, I can only train this with super high rep endurance type work. When in reality, as you're right, the soleus muscle itself can produce significant forces. There's a study that I told you I was going to reference there, Cardona 2019. Shout out to Brad Thorpe for putting me on this one a while ago that way. And it really changed the way that I train the soleus for myself personally, and even in my rehabs, because, it showed plain and simple, the soleus muscle can produce over 3,500 Newtons at max force, which is a lot more than we typically think of from a slow twitch muscle fiber standpoint. And when something can produce that much force, yet we train it with just body weight interventions, we kind of have to ask ourselves, are we getting what we really want to get out of the interventions that we're using that way? But before we get into like the training side, I think it's important to bring up that there's a number of other muscles and soft tissue structures in the lower limb that play a key role here. So, for example, I think the posterior tibialis muscle is often forgotten about, and that plays an essential role, from my view of things, supporting the arches at the foot in particular. I think that everyone kind of sleeps on this muscle and says, well, it helps with plantar flexion. It plays a role with inversion, but what else does it really do? When in reality, if we can't build stability from the foot complex itself, then we're really asking for a whole lot of other issues up the chain and even locally at the foot that way. And again, on the note of just mismatched training, I like the posterior tibialis biased heel raise with the little tennis ball. But again, I think a lot of times we just do it body weight, 3x15, 3x20. And I find a lot of times this is underloaded compared to the type of stimulus this muscle needs to undergo for actual adaptive changes, but also in general, like a lot of the athlete demands of sport that way are a lot more. I'll say sport demands a higher amount of force than just body weight exercise alone. So having ways to actually load these specific structures in our rehab programs, in our training that way is essential. And, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, how can you, account for all these smaller muscles or different muscles that way in your training? Can't we just focus on the big ones, the big buckets that way? And it's like, sure you could, but if we start missing these little things, then we're really just waiting for catastrophe to happen. You mentioned the Achilles tendon earlier on, and how soft tissue injuries are on the rise that way. If I just kind of think about this theoretically, conceptually that way, if I have a set amount of force that's got to go through my lower leg, so say I have 1,000 Newtons of force and it's going to go through my lower leg, and all I've ever trained is how to pass that through, Achilles tendon. Not to say the other tendons aren't going to do anything, but if that's the only thing that I train, then my body's going to rely on that pretty heavily in particular. Versus if I actually train all of these other muscle groups, because they all have tendons as well and transmit forces through the lower limb, the more, I guess I'll say, streams I have to divert force through, the less any one structure has to have the ability to take that force. So I want to make everything ridiculously strong and have the ability to withstand high force, but that also goes for all of the other smaller surrounding musculature in the lower leg as well. We can't just, go all in on Achilles loading and forget about all of the other muscles that play a key role down in this region.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And it's kind of like that, the concept that you're chatting about is, what I think a lot of times people will call stress shielding, right? Where the body will habitually load a certain tissue that is known to be able to take that load. And so that has been studied in different animal models and in different, conceptual papers outlining things from like the patellar tendon research as well. Yeah, I think it also brings up the importance of some of like the intrinsics within the foot. So a lot of times it is, similar where we think of, okay, cool. Well, if you have plantar heel pain or you have some type of intrinsic foot issue, well then, okay, let's just work on like the sequencing or the coordination of the toes where you do some marble pickups or something like that with your toes and those sorts of things, which, I mean, I'm not going to dog on any one method or implementation. I'm sure there may be a need for those sorts of things, especially if you're looking for certain like range of motion changes or those sorts of things. But when it comes to understanding something along the lines of like a sprinter, we know that something as silly as, great toe flexor strength is actually correlated with acceleration outcomes. And so we can then look at, okay, well, now is that just like a proxy for entire lower limb function, or is that something inherently specific to that great toe flexor complex that we need to train? That I don't know. I can't confidently say either way, but we at least know that there is a relationship there. And so with that, we can then play it safe and at least train some of those areas, right? So we can train the great toe flexors just like we would any other, area. You have to get a little bit more creative when it comes to loading. However, I've, found that doing the same kind of, implementing the same principles that we look at when it comes to, the length tension relationship as it pertains to muscles, how we can figure out ways to load certain tissues through those kind of lenses, right? Generally most muscles are going to be able to produce the most amount of force within mid portion. And then we can then kind of extrapolate from there whether or not we want to go down the rabbit hole of kind of other non-contractile proteins and how they influence when it comes to like eccentric contractions. But we know that there are going to be other support staff, and I think that that's very important. I do think that oftentimes it can be that quote unquote slippery slope that some people may look at and say like, okay, cool, well, something that I tried to touch on in the ebook that we had put out was the concept of Occam's razor, right? And by no means is it only do the simple things and ignore anything else that has an extra layer of complexity. But the way I look at it is you kind of have to earn that complexity. And so if you don't have peak force restored within that plantar flexor complex, right? We have normative data to suggest that in a seated position, for a field athlete, you should probably get about 1.75 to 2.0 times your body weight. Some people may go a little bit lower around that 1.6, but it just kind of depends on your anthropometrics and those sorts of things. But if you can't hit those numbers, I think that you're probably best suited spending time restoring peak force and force related qualities within the calf and Achilles complex rather than saying, well, we're at like 1.2, but they're still experiencing some, interesting, biomechanics. And so maybe we focus on something else. It's my bias that would lead me to say, hey, let's make sure that we can restore these qualities first. And then we can kind of look up and down the chain and look at other areas as well.
That's such a great point. You brought up a number of great points, actually, Dylan. I mean, first off, running it back through the importance of the intrinsic foot muscular strength, I could not agree more. I believe it's the flexor digitorum longus muscle group that is also one of the strongest in the lower extremity that's capable of producing over 2,000 newtons of force. And again, it's one of those things. It's like, wait a second, you look at the number and it's like, that muscle can do all of that. It really catches me off guard when we realize how strong these muscles are. And you're right, the marble pickup, I think everyone's seen it in the PT space in particular. Like anything, as you mentioned, there's a time and a place for everything in rehab. And if that's all the person in front of you can do, then great, do marble pickups. But understand, as you mentioned, marble pickups are not going to return to someone to elite sprinting performance. We have to do a little more than that. I love your concept too on the relation of, simplicity versus complexity and overall approach to rehab from a restoring ability to produce force standpoint here. I mean, plain and simple, I think too often, and I'm going to paraphrase something from a Stu McMillan presentation in Pittsburgh a few months ago. Essentially, we're all looking for the simple answers. We're all looking for the magic bullet to everything that we do. You know, how can we take all of these crazy things that we have going on and just simplify it to the point where everyone can understand it? And what's the simplest answer? What's the simplest solution? When in reality, these are complex problems. And sometimes we can't provide a simple solution to a complex problem. And instead, maybe we have to understand that it's going to get muddy. We're going to get into some gray areas, but we have to continue to press forward. Plain and simple, some of the recent cases I've seen in the lower extremity region, such as a Liz Frank injury that went unchecked for 5 years, there was no simple solution to that. We had a insanely unstable midfoot. So we had to get off into the weeds a little bit, but we were able to produce a good outcome. So understanding the relation of simplicity and complexity in rehab, I think is great. And on your point on force production and mechanics that way, I find a lot of times if you can restore someone's ability to produce maximal force outputs without pain, a lot of the mechanics just sort of correct themselves. Instead of getting lost in the sauce of, this drill versus that drill and this constraint versus that constraint, to a certain standpoint, restoring force output can fix a lot of that. So, again, is that simpler than, all these other little off in the weeds things I mentioned? Probably, but it's also complex enough where you have to understand, what am I doing with the exercises I've selected? Am I loading them enough to get the kind of outcome that I want in the first place? And then also you mentioned about restoring certain ratios of strength and so on that way. Well, if that's something that I need to test, how can I test it in a reliable and valid method? Because I find a lot of times, especially when it comes to the calf muscle group that way, some of these setups people use are rather suboptimal, in my opinion, to test calf strength. And I still think about, you referenced school earlier, not to throw stones at glass houses too much here, but the gold standard then was, can you do 30 single leg heel raises? And that's a 5 out of 5. So understanding that our testing and analysis process has to evolve with the nature of the athletes that we're working with that way. And if we are shooting for certain standards of strength to return to play or return to sport that way, then we actually have to have a method that we can repeat to ensure that the athlete is hitting those metrics, and then using that as almost like our own self-guided research, if you will, kind of creating a system or a framework where each athlete becomes part of a case study. And we look at what we did with the athlete. We look at how much we loaded them. We looked at the numbers and testing metrics. And then we look back and say, well, what can we do differently next time? And we continue to self-experiment or, adapt as we go that way and find a way to provide better for the athletes in front of us through that endless process of case study and case studies and experimentation that way.
You bring up a bunch of really good points. And I think, the idea of test repeatability and test reliability is really important. Something also to touch on is, like, you're totally right. The idea of what we did or what we were educated on of, a certain number of heel raises being, meeting a threshold for quote unquote strength. It's actually really interesting. There are a couple papers that have been put out, namely one from Sarah and colleagues in, I think it was 2021, where they more or less assessed a group of individuals where they did a, maximal heel raise endurance test, right? A calf raise endurance test. And then they also did a soleus-based peak force isometric assessment. And what they found was the people that could do the most heel raises weren't always the same people that were able to produce the most amount of force. And so now there's obviously different, mediators and moderators for those relationships, but most often what we're kind of seeing is that these two qualities of this kind of strength endurance and then this peak force are not the same. And so we can't just say, well, we restored one, so the other one's going to follow. We know there's a recent kind of preliminary paper was put out from Brady Green where they looked at certain constraints for a heel raise test, and they found that if you follow certain measures, along the lines of a 60-second metronome, you have, a 10-degree ankle dorsiflexion deficit. You are, limiting body rocking and body swing, and you have a constraint up against the wall, you're going to actually produce, or you're going to have on average about 12 less repetitions than a group that doesn't have those kind of constraints or controls. And so what that really tells us is that we do need to have a repeatable and reliable process for how we're measuring not only just peak force. We can get into that because there's a bunch of different debates on whether you test an end range dorsiflexion or mid range, or if you test in other positions or those sorts of things. But it's still important to even look at something as simple as a heel raise endurance test, because we know that there's going to be variable outcomes if you don't control for certain variables like time under tension, speed of contraction, total work done of force times distance, right? So there's a bunch of different variables that we need to really make sure that we're understanding and tracking, just because, they're different qualities. And so you can't just assume a quality, number in one test is going to lead to another quality number in the other.
That group that you mentioned there, do you know if they were the same ones that came up with the toe flexor, like minimized position for the heel raise test that way? There's someone I was talking with recently, and we chatted about this, where there's a variation of the heel raise where we have people do the heel raise, but we actually take the toe flexors out, because we find, and a lot of times, especially in the post-Achilles world, a lot of people compensate with the toe flexors to help with plantar flexion. And there was a testing setup proposed that would essentially reduce how much the toe flexors could contribute to plantar flexion by rendering them insufficient through length that way. Do you know if it was them that proposed that? Was that someone else? Or
I'm pretty sure it was a different group. I'm not sure. I know the paper you're talking about, but I'm not familiar with the authors. I know that this group was looking at healthy controls and didn't look at anything when it like associated with a past injury, like an Achilles tendon rupture or anything along those lines.
You brought up the point of testing and all of that sort of thing, and you're right. There's a lot of different factors and variables that go into testing that way, from a position standpoint to how often do we test, to when do we test, to what kind of metric or what kind of tool do we use to assess, hey, are we going to use some kind of dynamometer or load cell? Are we going to use some kind of force plates? Or, there's other individuals who will actually make the claim that, hey, maybe we don't even need to test, and we can just go based on the athlete's subjective feedback. And if the athlete says they're good and they pass, the general look test of watching them do the things that they want to do, and it looks as it did before, then they're good to go. And I think, from my standpoint, I think that the best answer kind of lies in a combination of everything. I think getting some dynamometer testing is important. I think getting some numbers from some force plates are important, but ultimately having all of that coincide with what the athlete tells you about the lower leg and how it feels and all that way, and then how it looks when they are doing some of these different movements that way, sprinting, jumping, all of that. I think all of that combined is really the most important thing. And the other piece I'll add to that as well is, if you are going to do the data testing that way, understanding what you're looking for from a metric standpoint. What are you trying to find? Like, if it's just peak force output, then that's a pretty easy conversation. But there's hundreds of metrics that can be assessed through the data and tech that we have this, in today's day and age. And I think that sometimes people make the mistake of getting lost in the world of the data and looking at every single number for every single test. And, there might be value in it, but by the same token, I think that there's a lot we still don't know about some of these different metrics, and there's a lot we have left to learn. So I'm at least personally a little bit guarded about drawing conclusions based on some of them right now. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts, especially with the work that you do in this space that way, on testing angles, testing positions, setups, return to sport batteries, if you will, for lower limb testing that way, or, if all of that is even required that way, if someone does have, the Achilles or high grade calf strain or something like that, does testing even need to take place? Because again, for every smart person I've met that feels like it needs to. I've also met someone who feels like it doesn't, and both have gotten great results.
I think they bring up a bunch of good points. When we look at the lower limb, or when we look at the ankle complex and the plantar flexor mechanism, and you compare it to something like the knee joint, I think a lot of times people love to use the ACL as a comparison. We know that people can kind of shy away from the quadricep, or loading the quadricep, or entire knee extensor complex, with various movement strategies and those sorts of things. We know that because it's a joint situated between two other relatively freely moving joints, that there's a lot more degrees of freedom for somebody to kind of explore around, and they're able to kind of offload. When we look at the ankle, it's actually quite difficult for somebody to truly offload the plantar flexor mechanism, right? It is not at all really like the knee, where it can look like they're loading it, but they're not. It's kind of similar to why we see in like the tendinopathy world. You can see patellar tendons often get pretty stiff as they have this kind of pathology coming about. Whereas when you look at the Achilles tendon, it actually becomes more compliant. And generally, the hypothesis there is that the Achilles tendon becomes more compliant because there's a pathological process going on, but there's no offloading of the tissue. And so it inevitably deforms more and more under load because there's a greater pathological process. Whereas with the patellar tendon, the individual can find strategies and ways to offload it. And so that tendon actually is not getting load to it. And so it stiffens up over time. So that's kind of just some things to think about I guess that could probably side more on the debate of maybe you don't need a test because it's really hard to avoid loading the Achilles or loading the calf. I still, granted, I have a large amount of bias. I work for a company that, does a lot of objective force testing and assessment strategies for these areas. So, I think that it's really important to really have a solid setup. And there's two main ways that I've seen it done, I've done, and that I've kind of found quality results with. One is this concept of testing with we'll just use it generically as a force plate for now, just because that's a very common way to assess this, because they have a high force potential, they have high sampling rates, and they're able to kind of get a lot more out of it rather than something like a crane scale or something like that. Nothing wrong with it. If you have it, then you're ahead of most of the PT population, so good on you. But when we look at something like a force plate assessment, one way to assess peak force in the plantar flexor mechanism is through putting the individual in end range dorsiflexion. That is a way in which you can kind of control for position, because they are limited in that position. They can't go any further. It allows for the individual, depending on their amount of dorsiflexion range of motion, it may actually change the lever, right? So it may go from if we know of like different types of levers, like a class 1 lever is when the load and the resistance are on different sides of the fulcrum, whereas class 2 and 3, they're on the same side. They just flip distances away from each other. And so depending on the amount of dorsiflexion range of motion, where the strap or where the rigid surface that you're pushing your thigh up into from the plantar flexion, depending on those locations, the lever of the assessment can change. And so I think that's an important consideration if you want to go down the end range dorsiflexion route, is that if you anticipate the individual to change their available dorsiflexion range of motion over the course of the rehab, that's just a consideration that you need to have, and that you could be changing from a class 2 lever to a class 1, or from a class 3 lever to a class 2, just based on the distance of the resistance arm and the moment arms associated with that. And so that's a really important consideration, in my opinion, because if you are changing the relative lengths of the moment arms, you may be seeing changes in torque output that aren't actually due to changes in force production from the muscle, but just from the angulation and from the moment arm changes. And so, again, that's not to say that it's a bad test or that you shouldn't do it that way. Similarly, you can see that I referenced it earlier, but there's some non-contractile proteins. So we know that, actin and myosin tend to be the contractile proteins within muscle. But then there's another non-contractile protein called titin that actually helps with resisting eccentric stress. And so what we can see is that you're actually able to tolerate a lot greater forces when in these kind of end range positions, which may not be due to the contractile properties of the tendon, or excuse me, of the muscle, but in reality due to the non-contractile elements that are situated there. Again, not necessarily a bad thing. Those non-contractile elements are present in other activities as well. So it's not like you're not testing a specific attribute that you see in sport or something along those lines. They're just things to know. Similarly, if you opt for the more neutral position, there are other considerations that you need to have in that most of the time, every setup that you have is going to have some amount of slack in the system. Even if you're working with steel bars and metal force plates and all these certain things, your tissues themselves, like your skin, your quadriceps, all those sorts of areas are going to deform under load. And so you may not be testing the same ranges of, fascial crossover and, joint position that you think you are. Similarly, depending on the length of time of the isometric test, you may experience things like tendon creep. So that can be another thing that you need to think about when it comes to the deformation of the tissues and those sorts of things. And so, in my opinion, there's no one right way, right? I've tested somebody in end range dorsiflexion, and I've also tested them in this kind of like 10 degrees of dorsiflexion, knowing that the slack will then take up and kind of push them into neutral. So either work. I just think that you need to make sure that as a clinician or as a strength coach or whatever your discipline is, you need to understand what those considerations are and understand the individual or individuals in front of you and appreciate the fact that you want to make sure that whatever it is that you're testing is going to be repeatable, and that if you see a change in the number, that it's not going to be attributed to the testing setup, but instead it's going to be attributed to the actual change in the individual's ability to produce force throughout the calf.
I think that's such a great point, and you bringing that up. I mean, that's why, in the post-op ACL world, I always remeasure. I always remeasure the moment arm length, because the moment arm could be a centimeter different just from my own adjustment that way. And a lot of times people neglect those things and they think, oh, well, it's not going to matter that much. But you're right, it can actually make a difference in the calculations that way. And I think the more we control for some of these different variables, the better our testing is going to be, and the more we're actually able to conclude things from the numbers that we do get, or I guess accurately interpret things from the numbers that we do get that way. And it's interesting having conversations with several people over the past few months, how many different considerations get, missed that way when they're doing these testing things. So for example, one individual that I talked with was using a barbell and pushing up into the rack. But they didn't actually measure the height of the J hooks that were holding the bar down. I was like, well, you might want to have that standardized so you're at the same height every time, because, 2 or 3, does it make a difference? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I'm not the data guy here. But, it's one of those things where the more variables we have in our testing setup, the less comfortable I am, at least in my opinion, drawing conclusions off of that. The other thing I'll see a lot of times on that rack setup, I had this conversation with someone just the other day, actually, where their rack was not bolted to the ground, and it would actually tip up off the ground when people would push. And there was a difference when they actually bolted it down. The numbers were very different, believe it or not. So understanding some of these other little nuanced things that go into the testing world that way, I think that there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. And going back to what we mentioned earlier on simplicity, I would like to make this so simple that anyone and everyone could set up these tests and do it reliably. But there are a lot of different considerations that go into this. And I think that it's something that, in order to get really good at, you have to spend a little time, digging into it, learning about it, and understanding it on a deeper level that way, in order to, really accurately apply it to the athletes that you do get to work with that way. Obviously we talk about testing here, which from what I've noticed mostly is done isometrically, but obviously from a training standpoint, which is where our past conversations definitely gravitated towards, I think it's important to not just test isometrically, but I think we should also train isometrically as well. I think that the benefits of isometric exercise are so well documented, from tendinopathy to so on that way, especially in this region where tendinopathies or, tendon ruptures, soft tissue injuries are so common. I think that iso loading makes a pretty good entrance to the conversation here. I actually, going back to your point earlier on toe strength, I believe there's some research coming out now about toe flexor strength correlating with longevity, comparable to hand grip strength correlating with longevity. And yeah, correlation does not always equal causation, but it is one of those cool little things to see, people talking about, hey, if your feet are actually stronger, you may potentially live longer. And the mechanisms that they propose that way make a lot of sense to me from just a general common sense, proposition that way. And the other piece, in addition to isometric training, we talked about earlier, loading these regions with enough force, enough resistance to actually drive change and adaptation. And I don't know about you, Dylan, but this is an area where I feel like having a safety squat bar in the clinic has been a game changer for us. So now we can actually load hundreds and hundreds of pounds and have people perform various exercises for their, plantar flexor complex that way. Or even we have a strongman yoke that'll make people carry different times. And having the ability to actually safely load people with 300, 400, 500 pounds of resistance has certainly been a game changer for us, just from the ability to, address and train some of these for specific qualities that we've talked about that way. And, that might not be needed for every single athlete that you work with, depending on the setting you're in and the type of athletes that you work with that way. The muscles can produce that level of force. It's just a matter of, do you have the athletes that are capable of expressing that amount of force? And if you do, then how do you train it safely and in a mechanism that gives you what you want from it? So at least on my end of things, yoke, safety squat bar, isometric training has all been really good implementations in our practice that way. And it's not the other piece I'll add real quick on this little tangent I'm on. It's not just about what you have from an implementation standpoint, but how you apply it as well and how it fits into your own programming framework. I kind of sprinkle in isometrics throughout the entire session. Some people use them as more of a warm-up. Some people use them as more of a, end the session with ISOs kind of thing. And there's not really one right or wrong way to do it, as long as you're getting results and doing right by the people in front of you that way. And I think that's where that whole concept of the art of coaching and the art of rehab comes in, is you can really go about this any one of 1,000 different ways and still get good outcomes. There's more than one way to skin a cat here, after all.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are plenty of different options and ways in which you can load. I also think, similar to kind of what we were talking about before, it's hard to avoid the calf, and so being able to find different opportunities and different options to load is definitely important. I tend to be partial when we look at different like loading strategies. I agree, the isometric ability to kind of load both tendons and muscles and all those sorts of things is actually really important, because the lower limb actually kind of has this quasi-isometric contraction throughout pretty much all phases and speeds of running. So you can look at somebody from 3.5 meters per second, which is around the high 7-mile-an-hour mark, I think, all the way up to 9 meters per second, which is over 20 miles an hour. And the calf is going to exhibit this kind of quasi-isometric concentric muscle action. And so what that does is more or less just shoves all of the tensile load and the strain associated with the kind of stress-strain relationship into the Achilles tendon. And so that, again, for a lot of different reasons that we kind of hopefully all know about the stretch shortening cycle and different tendon dynamics, is able to amplify the force production that we experience during those sorts of activities. And so ISOs can be super helpful looking at kind of the actual number of tensile, or like the amount of tensile load that we experience. You had referenced, which is great, 3,500 newtons, which is, 350 kilograms, upwards of, 700 pounds, right? That is an insane amount of body weight, or insane number of magnitudes of body weight. But even then, you are going to experience greater levels of load than you're able to physically produce. And so we have actually literature from Comey and colleagues in the early 90s, where we'll probably never get approval to do something like this ever again, but they actually situated load cells within muscle tissue to be able to kind of calculate, okay, what is the true tensile force going through these areas? And so instead of 3,500 newtons, it was actually 9,000 newtons. And so that's upwards of 12.5 times body weight. So something that's really insane when you think about acceleration, when you think about top end sprinting, when you think about all these sorts of areas, we know, okay, there's a really high tensile demand for these tissues. And so we want to make sure that these tissues are prepared for high tensile loads, especially if they are going to be experiencing them in things like, 0.1 seconds, right? 1/10 of a second is what we see with like ground contact times in rugby. And so if we think 50% of the gait cycle is when we start to see peak forces arise, well, that's actually not 1/10 of a second, but that's a 20th of a second because it's, half of the gait cycle. And so we see there's really high force demand, and then there's also a really high rate of force demand associated with these structures and with these tissues. I'm also partial to looking at isometric training as a way to do that, just because we know that we can, with a repetition duration reserve and with other different kind of isometric training principles, we can look at things and say, okay, we know that peak forces or a peak force sustained contraction is going to last at most if you're going all out for about 10 seconds. So then we can kind of reverse engineer our isometric training to incorporate high loads, really high rates of force development as well, in really constrained periods of time so that we can really train those positions, those demands, while maintaining the quality of each contraction relatively high. So we don't need to do these super long, enduring isometric holds that we think of with like the patellar tendinopathy research and those sorts of things. Those can be certainly still helpful when it comes to an analgesic effect and those sorts of things, but it's not necessarily going to prepare the lower limb complex for sustaining those loads. And so when we look at isometric training, there's a million ways to, put yourself in that position. I tend to replicate a lot of the testing positions as ways that we can kind of maximize force output, because that's what the test positions are supposed to do, is put you in a position to maximize your ability to produce force. And so those tend to be also really helpful, trainable isometric positions. I'm also really partial to then going into things like sled and prowler work, just because then it allows for, high loads, heavy loads directed at the calf. And you also start to, work on that kind of shear force that we talked about earlier with the concomitant plantar flexion and knee extension, so that gastrocs can kind of start to slide over top of soleus, and you can get that kind of more quality tolerance to those shear loads. So I tend to look at those sorts of areas. And then I also will just kind of look at, really basic, lower limb strengthening, right? A dynamic seated, calf raise, making sure that there's enough load on it so that the individual can't actually go through full range of motion, right? We know that there's a really significant drop off in force production once you get past 0 degrees of, a neutral ankle. So once you get into plantar flexion, the ability for your plantar flexors to produce force drastically drops off. So we know if you can do a full range of motion heel raise, you're probably not loading it heavy enough. So you want to stay in that kind of dorsiflex to neutral range for more or less optimal tensile, loads. So that's kind of the general gist of how I look at when we go for the idea of loading that complex. Another key consideration that I think is important to just reference is that when we're looking at a rehab, we don't want to look at return to running in the same way that we do with a hamstring, right? When you look at, that I had mentioned like 3.5 meters per second, right? The high 7 mile an hour, it's kind of like a trotting jog, right? It's quick, but it's nowhere near top speed. You're still already incurring about 6 times body weight through like your plantar flexor mechanism just in that kind of slower-ish jog, whereas you're only incurring about 2 to 3 times body weight in the hammies. And the hammies don't experience upwards of 6 times body weight until they get to 9 meters per second, which is over 20 miles an hour. So when we look at that, we see there's a really high force demand associated with the calf complex, and you have longer ground contact times. So that means that, higher load, higher amount of time, greater amounts of total impulse associated with the lower limb, even at slow speeds of running. So we want to actually stave off the return to run process for longer for something like a calf strain than we would with a hamstring strain. We know that, you can kind of do quick accelerations and those sorts of things with hamstrings pretty early on. And depending on the grade, severity, injury history, and that kind of aspect of the individuals, they'll be able to tolerate it pretty well. But when we look at the calf, we generally want to stave off from some of those kind of really high intent accelerations or long kind of plodding runs, right? The return to run should not look like a 400-meter effort at 30% of like just a kind of a trotting jog. It should look like short, quick shuttle runs or again, progressive plyometric loading. All of those sorts of variables are really important to kind of address when it comes to the lower limb as well.
It's so interesting to bring up the calf and the hamstring strain there. And it's interesting because as you mentioned it, my mind initially went to the, where we started anatomically. I was like, oh yeah, duh. The gastroc crosses the knee joint as well and also plays a role in knee flexion that way. And I think it's so interesting because that's something, we talked earlier about the contributions of individual muscles that way. And I don't think anyone has done the work on this yet, but it's one of those things where I'd love to see someone play around with, like, take the Nordic position, for example, and see if there's any differences with ankle position and what we see from hamstring strength. Do we change the contribution that may or may not be coming from the gastroc that way? And, I think that there's a whole conversation about implications that could be had from that, considering that the gastroc tends to promote anterior translation of the tibia, whereas the hamstrings are more of a posterior tibial translation type of drive that way. So one would be more protective from an ACL standpoint, and one would be more, in line with what we would consider an ACL mechanism. So I think that there's a whole conversation that could be had about that. And I think that in general, from a training side, I think the biggest, takeaways I have thus far from our conversation that way is, and testing and training, I should say, is understand the tissue that you're working with, understand the healing timelines, but also understand the forces that they are capable of producing, and then ensure that you're able to get someone back to those level of forces that they should be able to produce from that tissue. On top of that, make sure that your testing that you set up with in order to measure those things is set up in a way that you can repeat over and over again and account for all of the different variables that go into testing with force plates or whatever tech you decide to use that way. And from a training standpoint, understand that, as you mentioned, we are able to produce high forces, but we're also able to withstand even higher forces. So ensure that you're able to load the patients and athletes that you work with sufficiently in relation to what they can produce, but also understand that you need to load them accordingly in relation to the forces that they might have to absorb. And I think a great easy way to look at that further is break out a set of force plates, look at the force into the ground from, some of the different ISO tests, and then look at the force into the ground from a extremely high height depth jump. And obviously, if you're going to use that example, like, please be safe with it. Don't just put a random athlete up on a freaking 6 foot tall box and make them jump off if they've never done it before. Like, be a little mindful on that, but understand that the forces into the ground are, what we're measuring with something like force plates. So we can certainly train that ability to get high force in a very short amount of time through drops and other things that way. And I think that's something that Hunter Eisenhower, we had him on the podcast a while ago. He's done a great deal of work in that space through his force system that way. And I think that's something that tends to be pretty applicable from the calf training side of things as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the two things. One, it's important. The things that we kind of look at that you were referencing with the force plates, right? There's a difference between impact peak and drive off peaks, right? And so one is going to be more or less just like the force imparted onto the ground to attenuate the forces that are associated with a drop or those sorts of things, like, right, an impact peak, a collision. And then there's, drive off peak, which is more or less something that you're internally producing. So those are some just like general colloquial terms that people may talk about or discuss when it comes to those sorts of things. And then when we look at actually the muscle side of things, when you brought up the idea of, like, agonists versus antagonists to the ACL and those sorts of things, it's really interesting to see. The gastroc, I agree with you in terms of how it crosses the knee joint. There may be implications there. The beauty of that, though, is that the soleus, which is a higher force producing muscle, a muscle that produces force in earlier phases of stance, excuse me, that is actually going to be an agonist to the ACL. So it's actually going to have some posterior tibial translation with activation. And we also see that it has a similar, if not almost like exactly the same activation sequence. There's some data on, like, the neural firing patterns associated with both the the soleus and the vasti muscles, the quads, in just both treadmill assisted running, or I should say like Alter G assisted running, as well as standard treadmill running. And they see that more or less the soleus is helpful in decelerating the forward momentum of the shank, as well as then also propelling and obviously having that classic push-off mechanism that we know about. But the timing and sequencing and even grading of the forces associated with those muscles replicate similar patterns to the quadriceps. And so we can also see the calf as something that's very important as a protective mechanism for certain things like ACLs. We also know that ability to decelerate and reaccelerate the shank doesn't just occur in the sagittal plane, and that there's sidestep cutting maneuvers in which sagittal plane deceleration can actually lead to frontal plane acceleration type forces that the calf is able to produce. So there's a whole host of other kind of biomechanical information and data around the lower limb that we can always kind of chat about for years and years and years on end. But those are just some areas that I think are also important to chat about when it comes to making sure that we know what the lower limb is capable of doing and what implications that may have for something that goes beyond just you strained your calf or you have Achilles tendon rupture or tendinopathy or something like that. It can also be an agonist for things like hip flexor strains or those sorts of things because it can decrease hip flexor moment arms if you increase calf force production. So those are some other areas that we can kind of.
You brought up some great points there. I mean, the conjunction of the soleus with the quad, for example, is a great one. And it's so interesting because, again, on the training side of things, that's something that I always see hit together, right? Heel float and then bend the knee, which, again, is a great way to train. But, again, from a load standpoint, ensure that you load it sufficiently that way, because I think that everyone has been guilty at one point or another. I know I have, of prescribing those like lunge hold, heel raise type things that we see all the time. And again, not to say that there's not a time and a place for them, but understand that it's probably not providing you the amount of load that you need to really make any significant adaptive changes at either the quad or the ankle joint. So understand that, if you're going to use that, how are you going to load it? Or, is that a position that you feel comfortable loading in the first place? I think that there's a whole different conversation that could be had on athlete component to safety in loading that way, from the sense that like some athletes come to me and they just don't like certain things. Like, hey, I don't like back squat. Well, guess what? I'm not going to force the athlete to do something that they specifically don't love to do. So if there's, a component like that comes up here, understanding that you might have to adjust from what you initially planned on doing for a session in order to get the load in the structures that you're looking for, I think is a key piece as well. And again, we could go on about different little considerations like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's the floating heel idea. The way I see it is it's a terrible way to load the plantar flexor mechanism, but it's a great way to offload the knee. So if you have a really hot and sensitive knee, but you still want to train a split squat, I've actually found a lot of success in just having that kind of floating heel there, because the same mechanism that we talked about before, soleus can kind of act as a way to kind of pull back or have a little bit of posterior translation on the tibia, which can then again help to offload the knee. So for whatever reason, if that seems to be valuable to an individual in front of you, by all means, I think it's a great way to offload the knee, but doesn't really train the soleus all that much.
Yeah, no, completely agree. Dylan, for people who want to find out more about you or the profiling ebook that you mentioned that way, or any of the other amazing things that you do, the podcast and all that, where can they find you at online?
Yeah, I would say Instagram's probably the easiest. I tend to be responsive on it, or as responsive as I can be. My username is dylancarmody.dpt. So DYLANCARMODY.dpt. And yeah, feel free to reach out. You can also email me. It's just my name, pt@gmail.com. So Dylan Carmody, PT. Those are easy ways to kind of get involved or just reach out and stimulate a conversation. The link in my bio has plenty of links that people can follow if they want to look at the ebook or look at other things. And so that would probably be an easy way to do that. But yeah, Dan, I really appreciate you having me on. This is a fun conversation, and hopefully it's of benefit to some of the listeners.
Definitely, Dylan. I really appreciate your time and everything you're doing that way. And probably going to have you on at some point again in the future for a part two, because as you and I both know, we're really just scratching the surface here, and there's a whole lot more to unpack in this region.